Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here in person. Thank you for joining us online. We are going to dive into the next six-chapter segment of the book of 1 Samuel. Before we do that, let me open in prayer. God, we ask you to join us, excuse me, I ask you to join us this morning as we open your word, as we reflect on the things you brought to our attention during our week's readings, as we reflect on the discussion this morning. May they be accurate to your word. May they be accurate to your spirit. May they be guided by your spirit so that we can learn more about you, about your truth, and about how to apply it meaningfully into our lives so we can better reflect your Son, Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen. All right, so the readings that you were to have done this past week were chapters 19 through 24. I was remiss in disclosing that at the end of the beginning of last class, so I'm doing it now. And I'm also, by way of forewarning, you're going to finish the book of 1 Samuel, so 25 to 31 are the chapters. If you count your fingers, you're going to have to use your second hand and do 2 fingers. So there's 7 days worth of reading, 7 chapters. If you're doing the one a day, that means you got to read today. If today's been your day off, fit in a chapter this afternoon because we've got 7 chapters to wrap up the book. I think this is the only week, frankly, of our whole quarter where there's 7 days. So this is the one you're going to hunker down a little bit more than normal for. But in any event, yes, and then next quarter we'll have one. All right, open mic time. Anybody see anything that you wanted to ask about or talk about between chapters 19 and 24? In fact, I say 24, but let's not go heavy on 24 because 24 I've kind of lumped into next week's lesson, even though it starts at 25. There's a bit of a backstory that 24 provides, so I'll answer your questions if you have one on 24, but we're going to maybe exclude that from our roundtable discussions. Anything, though, from your readings this week? Yeah, Steve.
I noticed that Saul, it seems like from the reading that he forgets who David is. Is that just...
So your comment, I think, refers to right after Goliath is killed, and he says, whose son is this guy? Kind of like, who is this dude that just took him out?
I could have sworn it was more than once.
And it may have been.
In other words, when he's trying to kill him, he'll be like...
Oh, yeah, is that your voice? So sometimes the answer is when David calls out, is that you, David? I think your question, to rephrase, is Saul with it? Does Saul understand who this guy is?
Yeah, I thought it was odd. I thought
it
was
is.
like a Bible translation thing or something like that.
Yeah, no. Mine reads the same. Where I thought you went was Goliath. So the chapter, I think it was 16, was when David becomes the harpist for Saul, and it does ease him emotionally and with his whatever instabilities he had. And then the next chapter, this same guy kills Goliath, and Saul seems to not know who this guy is. So, sequentially, that doesn't seem. So one answer could be that they're not necessarily in sequential order. What I thought, the best footnote I saw for that particular one, which I know your comment is more than that, but the best answer that I found was in a footnote. And I'm going to just go to it because you brought it up. In verse 56 of chapter 17, in my translation it says, the king said, find out whose son this young man is. I think some of them said, find out who this young man is. Mine reads, find out whose son this young man is. And one of the scholars I looked at said, yeah, one, he could be absent-minded, so full of himself that he kind of loses track of the people around him, which probably is a bit of what's going on with Saul. His world revolves around him, and the periphery people are come and go. But that idea of whose son was possibly to provide the benefit that he promised whoever would go up against this Goliath and kill him, that person's household would be spared taxes. You kind of live a tax-free life. You wouldn't have to pay duty to the king or whatever else. It was earlier in that chapter. So some thought that reference was not so much who is David, but who is David's dad, so that we can put in our books and no one's knocking on their door come Dax Day and say, cough up for the king. That made a little more sense, but yes, Stephen, there still seems to be, even beyond chapter 17, at the very least, some level of absent-mindedness, maybe more likely a self-focusedness about Saul to where he seems to lose track of David, who seems to be a pretty important player in his life and in his kingdom. It is odd. I agree. Other thoughts, comments, questions from this week's readings? Yes, Joe.
I've read this several times, and obviously this might be obvious, but it really hit me this time just how consumed Saul becomes with killing David. It's like it's all he cares or thinks about it. And David didn't even do anything.
Yeah. Agree.
Obviously, he threatened. He felt threatened by him, but it just never hit me before just how all-consuming it became.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. And we're going to hit some of that in the lesson, so I'll defer to diving into that a little more in a few minutes. But absolutely, Saul becomes very jealous, irrationally so, and then David seems to be the object of that obsession for no good reason. Yeah. Other than, again, self-preservation. I want my kingdom, and I don't want this threat, and he is a threat, and all this kind of his brain took a left turn and did some wild stuff. Other thoughts, questions, comments from your readings?
I just can't believe Saul's lack of compassion in murdering all the priests. And, I mean, he was a very bad man.
So Stephen talks about the what Saul and his crew do to the priests at Nob. That is going to be the lesson today. So we will get there in a second, I promise. Any other comments? Yes, Chris.
I don't know how you really say it. Michal, David's wife.
Yeah, I don't know how to say it either. Right.
She allows David to be spared, helps David be spared from the vengeance of her own father by hiding an idol.
I saw that.
In the bed. Like, where'd you get the idol?
Yeah.
Why are we dealing with this? Didn't Samuel talk about this?
And my translation called it a household idol. Let me find where mine says that.
Maybe she got it from her daddy.
Where is that? Yes, I saw the same. You see that in movies sometimes where like the prisoner escapes and he puts, the pillows or whatever kind of form like a body. And we saw, for those who were here in prior one-a-days, Samson had done that once, kind of had a proxy of some sort in his bed when the whoever it was came to get him, and it turned out it was a dummy. But yes, I saw this one as well, and again, I can't find, oh, here it is, verse 13. Then I say Michal, just because Michael sounds too man. Then Michal took the household idol and put it on the bed, placed some goat's hair on its head, and covered it with a garment when Saul's men came in, whatever. So yeah, I had my question, this passage identifies the household idol. What and whose is that? I don't know the answer. Whose household? Is it the household of David and Michal, which would be very troubling, that David would allow this thing? Did she get it from her household, i.e., mom and dad? I'd like to think that versus the other. Either way, there's an idol that's in the residence of David because it's available for her to stick in the bed and, pretend it's David, and that does open up an intriguing line of questions that I don't know the answers to. Yeah, life-sized. Yes, Lee.
Last week we talked about, at least I did, questioning the total devoutness of the household. And I think...
This is Saul you're talking about now.
Yes, Saul's
Right.
household. Mm-hmm. And this object that's there, I don't think they had any problem with it. I just don't sense in everything that we're reading that the boy is just locked into Jesus or to God.
Right. No, I think.
It's there because it's a necessary weapon. We can carry the ark around, and we can defeat, and the priest can call on God, and we get some action. Mm-hmm. Saul was anointed. He seemed to be, on the road to kingdoms, never ending for 40 years. But there's just something that's loose about him.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, I think that's Joe said as much. The guy's wires don't seem to connect fully, and I agree. And some of it, I think some of it is probably some emotional, instabilities or psychoses, perhaps even. I think much of it is spiritual warfare going on, in his world and his lack of full alignment, full worship. We had that issue of first or second lesson, devoted fully to me. I think Saul was a half devoted to God, half devoted to other means by which he could achieve his end, or so he thinks. Steve.
In regards to that, because I never saw this before, it's been a long time since I read this, but it was, he says that he spared like the best of the sheep, his like first
Yep.
disobedient thing.
Yep.
It says why he did it. He was like, because I feared the people. Apparently, like they were upset that like you're just gonna kill all these things and not give it to us. You're not gonna give us any of the spoils of this war or whatever. And so he relented to, you know, his subjects, I guess.
Yeah, good point. You know, and in fairness, none of us have ever had the experience of being king or governor, you know, or some position of power where, one, you have the influence of power, the corrupting influence of power, and two, you have competing interests that are vying for your attention and your decision making. And he's, you know, to that example that you said, Stephen, you know, he has orders from God, which were really clear, and we talked about that last week, but he also has the people around him that might be muttering in his ear, why are you going to slaughter all this choice stuff? And so I think he was in a tough position by being king, by being the first king. I mean, so he doesn't have like a heritage of kings to look back on and, you know, learn the lessons of past kings. He was the first one. Not to excuse his behavior at all, but maybe to set his life story in a context that is appropriate. All right, any other thoughts? You guys are great. Appreciate the feedback, appreciate the readings.
Actually, I'll say probably I am the only identifying Christian that is not Catholic.
Okay.
There's several Catholics, but I'm the only one that's Baptist or anything else.
Got it? In your workplace, you're saying?
So, yes.
Okay.
But none of my employees are Christians. So I get a lot of questions, and I always say I'm going to answer from a biblical view of this, or do you really want this answer? And so a lot of the questions that come at me are why can God allow evil? Why does God do this? Why does God do that? And that's the evil spirit of the Lord. I took a deep dive on that. I was like, okay, because I think these are the questions that we need, because the smart people go into the Bible and they look for things that they're like, they give to a Christian who doesn't know any better, and they're saying, you know, hey, God gave an evil spirit. He's not a good God. And you have to be able to know how to answer that when somebody comes at you like, well, I just don't know. So,
Thank you for raising that, because that's a
I had
difficult. Yeah, let me.
grab it.
No, this is good. And I want to hear your feedback. So let's go to chapter 19, because that's where this verbiage first shows up. I'm going to read where I find it in mine. I think it's verses 9 and 10 is where we first see this. Verse 9. So in my translation, well, what is your, since you brought up, what does your translation say? Just read verse 9 if you would, Tiffany.
And the evil spirit from the Lord was upon Saul, and he sat in his house with his javelin in his hand, and David played with his lyre.
All right, very good. What translation is that?
It's King James Version.
New King or?
No, it's King
Okay.
James. I changed the word hand to lyre, because I have two different, it sounds weird if he played with his hand.
Okay.
If you end it right there,
Fair
it
enough.
just sounds like he's.
All right, fair enough. We'll stop. All right, so but the phrasing that mine also has, I'm reading Holman Christian Standard, which is now just called the Christian Standard, but mine says, an evil spirit from the Lord. So if you got rid of the from the Lord, and you read that verse, an evil spirit came upon Saul, all that would be, I mean, more comfortable. The phrase from the Lord, and it's not just in this chapter, it shows up one or two more times, I recall, within this week's readings. The from the Lord part is really, I think, frankly, uncomfortable. It does raise that question, and it's a fair question. You believe in God, He's a loving God and all that. What's that?
16,
All right, all right. So 16. So it shows up back in 16, chapter 16. Okay. Thank you. So 16:14, Jim advises, and Greg concurs. Now the Spirit of the Lord left Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord began to torment him. Okay, so it did show up prior to that, and I think it shows up another time after 19. I recall there's like 3 times. Here's what I saw, then Tiffany, I want to hear what you, if you did the deep dive, it might have been deeper than mine. So an evil spirit from the Lord can, I think if you just step back and just look at it honestly, can mean a few things. I'll tell you where I think it does and where I land, but one of it could mean that indeed God is evil. I mean, you could say that this is an attribute of God. That could be one conclusion for this phrasing, a very uncomfortable conclusion, I think a wrong one. You know, he shares some of himself, and this is the evil part of himself. One could be an evil spirit that God created not as an image bearer of himself, but created an evil spirit and allowed the evil spirit to do this thing. One could conclude that the spirit was from the Lord, and the spirit became evil. So the evil is a modifier of spirit from the Lord rather than evil spirit as a cluster, and God is involved in that. And I frankly land there. My theology, my understanding of all this is God is the only creator. So that means that all spirit beings, all angels, were created by God. They didn't pre-exist. They weren't coexistent with God. God was the beginning. In the beginning was God. So anything that is other than God is created by God. That's where I stand. And so all the spirit realm, all the heavenly angels, including those that rebelled, were created by God. I believe the fact that some rebelled means that the angels were given free will, as were humans, and some chose to exercise that free will in allegiance to God and in honoring God and obeying God, and some chose to rebel against God and try to be like God, Satan being the leader of that crew, and others followed. And humanity has the same choice, to obey and align with God or to do otherwise. So I think ultimately with this phrasing, again, I don't like the from the Lord. I wish it wasn't there, but the Holy Spirit inspired whoever wrote the book of Samuel to have that phrasing in there 3 times. I think this is an example of God allowing something he created that through its own free will exercise became evil. God allowed that thing to be his instrument of judgment or discipline, and kind of have a little longer leash, so to speak.
No different than God created Lucifer.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what he became.
Right, right. And we've seen already, and we will see as we get further into this semester, because it's going to spill over into next quarter. God uses pagan nations. I mean, he used Babylon, and he uses Syria. I mean, he used a lot of nations to come at his defiant people as a means of discipline in hopes that they repent, and they don't, and ultimately they get conquered by these nations. God is not endorsing the pagan nations. He's not approving them or even, forcing them to be who they are, but he says, okay, Israel, you're not listening. Judah, you're not listening. I'm going to open the door wide and let the Babylonians come in and just take over, or the Assyrians or the whomever else. I think in this situation, because of the things that we've talked about, and Lee mentioned again, because Saul's heart was less than fully devoted to God, that for whatever the reason, for God's reason, he allowed this spirit that he created that chose to become evil, he allowed that thing to begin tormenting Saul. And we see it as early as chapter 16 and throughout, and I think that's part of the nutsiness that we see in him, having this obsessive pursuit of David, feeling David is this threat to him, and I can't see anything else other than this threat, and that's all I live for. That's kind of where I land on the whole evil spirit from the Lord. I've talked a lot. Did your deep dive reveal anything different, or do you want to share anything?
Succinctly, I guess.
Okay.
There's 2 different words, Hebrew words for evil. One is ra, and one is, I think, rosh. Ra means more calamity and destruction, and that's the word that's used in this one. Rosh is the moral evil, and that is never used with God. Ra is used with God.
Interesting.
So
an agent of destruction?
Basically what it means is God sent this spirit to him to make him decide, and the decision caused calamity. That's where the deep dive I took.
Okay, no, that's good.
I don't like the, God hardened his heart. We talked about
Yeah,
that last time.
right,
And
Pharaoh.
it's like, really? Like, how do I get around this? I don't think that God is, but it's more God took his hand off of him and allowed the evil to just dwell.
Yeah.
So that's where I make terms with that.
Okay, it's a difficult phrase, and I did have that. I made note of that, and I was going to be kind of prepared to the extent somebody asked, and Tiffany did. To me, that was one of the more difficult things we've read so far. That phrase, "evil spirit from the Lord." Yeah, you can pause there, and you can say that disproves the living God, and I'm never going to believe. So, I think you brought that up, and to reiterate, you brought that up as one as a curiosity, but more as maybe a warning that we need to be mindful. We need to be aware of passages like that. When we see them, let's not just, ignore it and move on, because who knows, the next day, for whatever reason, our cubicle mate or whatever else might knock on our door and say, you believe in the Bible, don't you? Well, somehow I read this, and what do you make of that? Not that you're going to always have the answer, but if you're aware of passages like that when you're reading, and if you pause at least, whether you do the full deep dive that Tiffany did, or something less, allow that to be in your conscience, so that when and if you're asked, hopefully the Holy Spirit can use the fact that you saw that verse and you pondered a little bit to maybe work an explanation out of your mouth that you hadn't honestly prepared, but the Holy Spirit can use that and use your faith and present some kind of a cogent response to what could be a very difficult question. So I think that's a good advice. That's what I heard. All right, thank you. Let's go to chapter 20. Sorry. Yeah, go to chapter 21. I'm gonna set a little backstory. But chapter 21. No, I'm sorry. 18 is where you're supposed to start. Go to 18. We're going to touch on the Nob episode and King Saul being seemingly irrationally obsessed with this pursuit of David. I know 18 was not necessarily this week's readings, but it's a relevant backstory. Can somebody read for us, Mark, you have the room. All right, thank you. Can somebody read for us verses 28 and 29 of 1 Samuel chapter 18? Show Mark by hand so we can come over there. All right, Joe, thank you.
When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. All
right, so that sets the stage for what we're going to really discuss. Saul has this awareness, accurate awareness, hey, June, welcome, that the Lord was with David. I think fairly spiritually insightful to have that awareness. So there is something about Saul that's, tuned in to some extent to realize the Lord is no longer with me. The Lord is now with David. And his response to that is jealousy. This passage says, he is now afraid of him and is now going to be a lifelong enemy. So he begins to act on that fear and that mindset. I made the comment that Saul, thankfully, apparently he's a good warrior. Apparently he's not particularly good with the spear, because he tries unsuccessfully 3 times. I'm going to read them because they're funny. So time number 1, chapter 18, beginning verse 10. The next day, an evil spirit from God took control of Saul, and he began to rave inside the palace. David was playing the harp, not playing with his hands, playing the harp as usual. But Saul was holding a spear, and he threw it thinking, I'll pin David to the wall. But David got away from him twice. So apparently he threw it, I didn't realize, he threw it to him twice there. Chapter 19, verses 9 through 10. Now an evil spirit from the Lord came on Saul as he was sitting in his palace holding a spear. David was playing the harp, and Saul tried to pin David to the wall with the spear. As the spear struck the wall, David eluded Saul and escaped. And then later, in chapter 20, Jonathan talks to Dad and says, why are you so mad at David? David's been a faithful servant to you. He's been a very productive general. You remember all that? And Saul in verse 32 here, Jonathan. So Jonathan answered his father back. Why is he to be killed? What has he done? Then Saul threw his spear at Jonathan to kill him, so he knew that his father was determined to kill David. So again, Saul's bad with the spear. But he's very clear in demonstrating David is indeed his enemy. And David knows this. So David has fled for his life through Michal's help, getting out of the household with the household idol, serving as a proxy in the bed or whatnot. So now go to chapter 21. That's where we're going to really camp out. So that's some of the backstory. David's running for his life, essentially. Can I get somebody, so we're in 1 Samuel chapter 21. Can somebody read the first 2 verses? Again, show us by hand so Mark knows where to go. All right, Stephen, thank you.
David went to Nob to Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech trembled when he met him and asked, "Why are you alone? Why is no one with you?" David answered Ahimelech the priest, the king sent me on a mission and said to me, no one is to know anything about the mission I am sending you on. As for my men, I have told them to meet me at a certain place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever you can find.
Perfect. All right. So David shows up at Nob, and the priest is afraid. First off, why would the priest be afraid? Thoughts on why that was his initial reaction? Reputation. Okay. Good. All right. So reputation of Saul. So he wasn't necessarily afraid of David, but maybe David's here on Saul's behalf, and what does this mean for me? Good. I hadn't thought of that. Good.
Maybe he knew Saul was after David, and that scared him.
Okay. Maybe the word was out that David's a wanted man, and now he's shown up in my household, and does this put me in peril? We're not really told why. You know, I went to the direction of David was, I hadn't thought it through quite like Lee had, but that David, was productive, and he exacted, Israel's judgment, maybe on Saul's behalf. In any event, the king's initial fear is, oh no, I know who you are, and I'm uncomfortable by you showing up alone in my place of worship. Why are you here? And David's answer is essentially what? Well, paraphrasing what Stephen wrote. What was David's answer?
On the king's business.
On the king's business, yeah. And it's a secret mission. The king has sent me, and no one's supposed to know. All right, was that true? All right, so again, we kind of skipped through it, but that's not true. This is after he fled the town because the king was in this enraged state. I'm going to kill David, so David's running for his life. He is not on a secret mission for the king. What about this men that he's alluding to that's waiting for him at this other place? Were there any men? Was David with men at this point?
Weren't they the worthless men?
Well, later on, they were, the motley crew, but they show up in chapter 22, verse 2. Yeah, who were desperate, in debt, or discontented. Those are the folks that rallied around him. So the point is, they show up in chapter 20. There were no men. So David's alone, fleeing for his life. Hey, Ahimelech, open up. And he opens up, So he comes in here, and David tells Ahimelech this stuff. Why did David lie? Well, first, are we agreeing that his responses were not truthful? And I'm going to be more blunt and call them lies. Why did David lie to this priest in this moment, in this encounter? Preserve his own neck. Why would he feel the need to do that to this priest? What fear would he have from this priest?
He doesn't know how far Saul's reach is and who is, allegiant to him.
Okay, good answer. So for all David knows, this guy and any other guy he encounters, is going to be quick to turn David in if they find him or catch him or whatever else. I agree with that. I agree there was deceit. I agree it was deliberate. And I agree ultimately it was for self-interest. Most any deceit, if not every deceit, we will ever be tempted to do and or perform is with that same goal, self-interest. Whatever the packaging for self-interest might be at that moment, in this case it's saving his own life, in another it might be an advancement in a job, in another it might be avoid embarrassment, whatever the thing might be at that particular moment, at its essence, self-interest inspires deceit, and it did for King David, a man after God's own heart. So he has this opportunity, fleeing for his life, coming upon Nob, a priest. It's not like he's just lying to some Joe. Lying to some person. He's lying to a priest. I don't know why that term comes. All the Josephs in the world don't like that. Not just any old regular person, but a priest. And he's lying to this priest. First, you read perfectly, and you got into the men which I asked for. But there were two lies. He was there for looking out for himself. He alluded to the fact that there was men, and I need some food for my men. The part about, so go ahead.
He could have been lying to not bring him into helping him escape, where then Saul might go after Ahimelech.
Great. So Jim, for the live stream folks, Jim thought, maybe in David's mind, if I don't tell this priest, then maybe the priest is spared trouble. That's a compelling rationalization. An example, of compelling rationalizations we might have in our own brain when we have a similar moment. Well, if I don't tell the truth, then these 5 good things can happen, so maybe it's better to deceive and to not tell the truth. That may be his reason. Again, we're not really told why he lied. I think we're clearly told that he did lie. And I'm glad you said that, because that's ultimately kind of the point that I'm going to try to make in the end. Anyhow, so he says these two things that are untrue, and he asks for the priest for some provisions. Pick up, Stephen read chapter 21, 1 through 3. Can somebody pick up reading verses 4 through 6? Same chapter. We're just going to continue on the passage. Rennie, over here. Mark, thank you. Hang on one second. Let our microphone get to you.
But the priest answered David, I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women. David replied, Indeed, women have been kept from us as usual whenever I set out. The men's bodies are holy even on missions that are not holy. How much more so today? So the priest gave him the consecrated bread, since there was no bread there except the bread of the presence that had been removed from before the Lord and replaced by not hot bread on the day it was taken away.
Perfect. Thank you, Rennie. All right, so now again, he ended up from Stephen's passage about can you spare food, essentially. And the priest said, I don't have any regular food. I have basically holy food. And it's not to be used for dinner. That's all I got. And the priest is, I think, in his mind saying, I'd be willing to give it to you all as long as you are essentially holy, as long as you and your men have been consecrated, and have abstained from sexual relations. And he says, now he's getting more into the whole description of his men. The first is kind of a passing reference to men. Now the priest, not meaning to, I think, kind of presses him on the whole, are you sure your men are okay to be eating this, because this should be treated different than regular old bread. And so now he's talking about, we've kept the women away, and my men's bodies are consecrated. So now he's kind of neck deep in this whole story about there being all manner of men with him. Again, the men don't show up until chapter 22, when he's in this cave and his brothers, and then this motley crew shows up to become his men. So again, why does David continue? Why does he dig deeper this deceit about the men and their having abstained from any relations with women and all this stuff?
Validity to his story.
Yes, to add validity to the story that he started with. I am in the midst of my household. I have a couple of roles, a couple of hats I wear, one of which is the early morning science teacher. In our home school, the McCarthy Boarding School for Boys. I am the science teacher. That is what we call our school, at least internally. So I have taught lots of science, and I've taught physics a few times. And one of the things that I analogized to this moment, to elaborate on what Greg said, is the difference between static friction and kinetic friction, just to kind of melt your brain a little bit. Friction we hopefully understand is the resistance when two objects make contact with each other. And typically friction is used for hard objects, solids, as opposed to resistance, which would be air or water that are going to be liquid or gas. So anyhow, friction would be like this floor and this podium. And the idea behind static friction is that the force needed to overcome static friction is greater because at the microscopic level, those two solids have kind of nestled and their atoms and molecules have kind of found the grooves and they're really kind of sitting good and snug. And it takes a little more effort to kind of move that thing and to break the resistance that static friction causes. Once it's moving, once you have begun that movement, it becomes kinetic friction and the force required is less. So it's harder for me to push this thing from a stationary position to begin moving. Once it's moving, it's easier to move because, again, those molecules aren't nestled together anymore. They're rubbing against each other still, but it's not quite in the same level of groove. And what the heck does this have to do with this Bible passage? It has to do, I think, with David's initial lie being the equivalent of static friction. I would like to think and hope that there was some level of resistance from David starting off this story. I'm sitting here in front of a priest, and I'm hungry as all get out, and I'm running for my life, and this guy's asking me a difficult question, and what do I do? I'm hoping that he's kind of going through in his mind, I hate doing this, but I'm on a secret mission from the king, and my guys need, whatever. He starts this story. Once it started, the force needed, the resistance opposing the continuing of the story is less. Once this podium starts moving, the force opposing the movement is less because I've transitioned from static to kinetic friction. I think what happens here, to elaborate a little bit more on what Greg said, is that once the story started, once he overcame the initial reluctance to tell the first part of this lie, the rest of it is a little easier to tell. Because of compulsion, this needs to be a credible story. If I say there are no men, then the whole story falls apart. I got to talk about the men. Now this priest is challenging me. How pure are these men? Now I got to get into all this. But he's doing that, and he's doing it, I think, again, because the reluctance, to now use human terms, the reluctance to tell a lie is lesser once you already have done it. Once you've begun a particular lie, and it's like a long lie, or once you become habitually comfortable with being deceitful, the resistance to the next time is lesser. The ability to do that is easier because I've done it before, or I'm continuing the same story, it's a long story, and this guy's challenged me. So part of what I'm seeing in this episode is akin to that whole static friction versus kinetic friction. David begins telling a lie. Again, I don't think the priest was challenging him or trying to see if this is a true story. He's saying, I'll give you the bread, or, are your guys fit to have it, essentially? A fair question, I think an innocent question, and now David has to get a little deeper into the whole story about my men, and sure enough, they're deep, they've been away from women and all this stuff, and suddenly the lie now becomes this big, ugly thing. But David doesn't see it that way, and we're going to get to that. Let me pick up and read verses 9 through 7. So the priest gives him the bread. Sorry, I said 9 through 7. 7 through 9. Picking up chapter 21, verse 7 through 9. One of Saul's servants detained before the Lord was there that day. His name was Doeg the Edomite, chief of Saul's shepherds. David said to Ahimelech, do you have a spear or a sword on hand? I didn't even bring my sword or my weapons. Why? Since the king's mission was urgent. So again, he's kind of stuck in this deal. I've dug this hole. I'm neck deep in it. I can't climb out now. So, I need a weapon because the king sent me off this secret mission. It was so urgent I didn't even go home and, pack my weapon belt. The priest replied, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. So basically, take the sword. David said, that's a great sword. I would love that sword. Okay, it's your sword. So off he goes. So David now leaves, goes back to his camp that consists of David alone, with consecrated bread, with the sword, and having lied to the priest at Nob. The sad story continues in chapter 22. Saul, in the beginning part of chapter 22, Saul is again, my Bible has as the editorial subtitle for chapter 22, Saul's increasing paranoia, and I think that's very accurate. So Saul's again now in this ruminating rage. David is after me. I hate David. Nothing else matters to me but killing David. I mean, this is kind of where his brain is. The kingdom, I don't care. I want David. So he's in this whole deal. Everybody's coming against me. Nobody wants me as king. I mean, his brain just goes into this massive conspiracy theory, and all y'all are out to get me, and you're following David, and blah, blah. So then, as he's spewing these irrationalities, who shows up but Doeg the Edomite, the guy that was there at Nob, in the back corner of the room or whatever else, and he tells the king some information. Can I get a reader for chapter 22, verses 9 and 10? Again, I need the hand in the air. Mark needs the hand in the air to know where to go. Stephen, all right, we'll get you. Somebody else take over from Stephen, because we're going to read a little bit more of this. So Stephen, just 9 and 10.
But Doeg the Edomite, who was standing with Saul's officials, said, I saw the son of Jesse come to Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, at Nob. Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for him. He also gave him provisions and the sword of Goliath, the Philistine.
All right, perfect. Sorry there. All right, so this guy, Doeg, says, King, you're wondering where David is? I know where he was kind of recently. He was in the area of Nob because he showed up at, and talked to the priest, and the priest said, Edom, Doeg gives an accurate report. You might say, well, there's nothing mentioned about the whole inquiring of the Lord. There is when the priest gets questioned in a few minutes. We don't see that in chapter 21, but we do see that the priest confirms as much and says, I do that all the time. Why are you mad at me, king? I do that for you. I do that for David. I do that for everyone else. So I say this is an accurate report. Doeg saw it. Doeg told the king, here's where David was, and he got provisions, and he got the sword of Goliath. So David is now, his whereabouts or his recent whereabouts are disclosed, and Saul, in a fit of rage, wants to act on that. So somebody picking up verses 11 through 15, same chapter, we're just continuing the narrative. So somebody raise your hand. All right, Chris over here. Thank you. Give us a second, Chris. Yeah, yeah, you can keep a distance. Just read normal, Chris. You're good. Go for it.
So the king sent to call Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all of his father's house, the priests who were in Nob, and they all came to the king. And Saul said, Hear now, son of Ahitub. And he answered, Here I am, my lord. Then Saul said to him, Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, that he should rise against me, to lie in wait, as it is this day? So Ahimelech answered the king, and said, And who among all your servants is as faithful as David? Who is the king's son-in-law? Who goes at your bidding and is honorable in your house?
Perfect. Thank you. Actually, I had to go to 15, so one more. Sorry.
One more?
Yeah, sorry.
Did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Far be it from me. Let not the king impute anything to his servant or to any in the house of my father. For your servant knew nothing of all of this, little or much.
All right, good. So first off, Saul says, you're conspiring. So again, this idea of Doeg says David showed up and he got some bread and a sword from the priest of Nob. So Saul's mind is, okay, that's a conspirator. I'm going to confront him. He does confront him, and he says, I find it curious at the end of verse 12, so that he, David, could rise up against me and wait in ambush, as is the case today. So Saul has in this mind that David's just lurking. That's not true, and there's nothing in the passages that we've read to suggest that, but again, Saul's obsession has gone beyond rationality. He's irrationally fearful of David, and he believes any moment David's going to come out with the sword of Goliath and skewer him and do better work with the sword than Saul could do with his own spear. So he's just afraid of David, and he's certain that everybody else is helping David. So the priest is called in and says, basically, I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, David showed up. Yes, I did. That was not the first time I inquired of the Lord for David. I've done that often, as I do for you. He didn't say it, but I'm assuming he probably did of King Saul as well. If this guy's praying for the Lord's favor for King David, or for David, I'm sure he's praying for the Lord's favor for King Saul. So the priest is basically saying, I don't know what you're talking about. What? All right, pick up verses 16. We're just going to kind of continue the narrative. I'll pause along the way. Let's find it. Can I volunteer this table? So Sharon's table over there. Can you all just kind of keep Mark from wandering around too much? Can somebody at that table just read verses 16 and 17?
And the king said, You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all of your father's house.
All right, pause right there. So he's pronouncing death to not only the guy who's answering, but to his whole house. Amazing. All right, continue one more verse, Sharon.
And the king said to the guard who stood about him, Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David. And they knew that he fled and did not disclose it to me. But the servants of the king would not put out their hand to strike the priests of the Lord.
So again, my translation reads like yours, Sharon, turn and kill the priests of the Lord. So Saul is even describing them accurately. These aren't rogues. These aren't, imposters. These are actually priests of the Lord. Kill them. And I love that the king's servants are like, yeah, no, I don't want to do that. That's a little extreme. But someone else is willing to do it. I'm sorry, Mark, if you can stay over there. Somebody else pick up from that table verses 18 through 19. And then Sandy, I'll get you next time, promise.
Okay.
Go ahead.
The king then ordered Doeg, You turn and strike down the priests. So Doeg the Ammonite turned and struck them down. That day he killed 85 men who wore the linen ephod.
All right, pause right there. So this guy has no qualms with that. He's an Edomite, so maybe he has less allegiance, to the whole idea of priest of the Lord. Kills not only that one person, kills 85, you see here. The whole, this priest crew, everybody, his family, his household, gets summoned. The priest is the only one from the record who had any dealings with David, according to chapter 21. He dies, as do 84 others. And it's even worse than that. Continue, Lee, one more verse.
Guy's busy.
Yes.
He also put to the sword Nob, the town of the priests, with its men and women, its children and infants, its cattle, donkeys, and sheep.
All right, so not only the one guy who actually interacted with David, not only all the priests, now basically the whole city just gets wiped out. Terrible, sad. Sharon, were you going to say something? Okay. All right.
But Blaine, earlier on, when God told Saul to kill all the people and their family, their children, their infants, their cattle, he disobeyed God, but yet he, in his own fear, decided to kill everything.
Oh, that's a good point, Greg. When ordered by God to do a similar thing, he didn't want to, but of his own accord, he's happy to do it.
Yes.
Great point. I hadn't thought about that. That's a good observation. Yeah, he seemed, although he didn't get his own hands dirty, he let this Edomite guy, take care of business for him. But yeah, that's an interesting. When it serves self, the first directive, God said, wipe out, everything, including the best animals. That didn't seem to serve self as much, so I'm going to keep the best. Now the idea of killing does serve self, so we're going to do it. Excellent point. Lee.
But the Edomite also had a different mindset and different worldview than Saul. I think he had no compulsion about not killing anything.
Yeah.
Because he didn't have an idea or a worldview of sacrifice and that sort of thing. Even though it was kind of dull in Saul's mind, it was still there.
Yeah.
But this guy, he is all about zero in terms of God.
Agree. All about big number one, which was himself. Sandy, raise your hand. I'm sorry, Mark. Can you go back one more time? I'm going to let Sandy finish out this passage, 20 through 23, if you're willing to.
But one son of Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled to join David. He told David that Saul had killed the priest of the Lord. Then David said to Abiathar, "That day when Doeg the Edomite was there, I knew he would be sure to tell Saul. I am responsible for the death of your whole family. Stay with me, don't be afraid. The man who wants to kill you is trying to kill me too. You will be safe with me."
All right. So David has something of a confession. Honestly, I find this confession a little less than full. It seems what David says is, darn it, I should have done something about Doeg, or Doeg, I've called him. It wasn't so much I lied and my lie has caused all this. It's that I knew that rat was going to go tell the king, and he did. So I have, in the interest of wrapping this up quickly, some takeaways that I see from this passage. The one that we discussed already. Initial deceit often prompts continued deceit. The resistance is less the more you do it. Typically, the first is the hardest, and then it gets easier from there. Probably with anything, and lying would be one of those anythings. Second, deceit is not a victimless crime. David, I think, just wanted food so he could survive the next day or few days, would love to have a weapon in case someone came after him. Probably wasn't thinking that I'm putting this priest in great peril, although one of you suggested that might have been a reason why. That was a good insight. Often innocent people are harmed by our lack of truth. And we see here a very extreme portrayal of that. Little harmless white lies are neither little nor harmless. Last, and I'm kind of keying in on David's response, we often fail to recognize the harm that our deceit causes. So as this one survivor runs and finds David and tells David, David's mind goes to Doeg who told. David's mind doesn't go to, oh my goodness, I can't believe I asked for bread and I asked for a weapon, and because I lied to the priest, it was more about, I should have done something with Doeg. He was there. I knew he was there, and I'm mad that come stay with me. It was, to me, kind of a not really repentance at all as to his underlying. And I think in part because David was not maybe David did not rationally connect his deceit to the eventual dire consequence that came and that take away from us, as we can often do likewise. We cannot recognize the harm, the repercussions, the aftermath that our deceit causes. So I take away from this story, and hope that you all do, the dire consequences of deceit is what I call, deceit's dire consequences is what I call this lesson. And King David, pre-King David, gives us a very vivid illustration of such things. Let me close this in prayer because we were a little over time already. God, a difficult passage, Lord, a story that we can read in the third person and not read in the first person, but Lord, this is a passage that maybe illustrates behaviors of our own, our lack of resistance to portraying deceit, to continuing deceit, the consequences that come from that, the innocent people that are harmed as a result. Lord, I pray that we are more aware of such things in our lives. I pray that as we encounter opportunities to be truthful or not, that we do not rationalize a lack of truth, that we trust in you being truth and that that is enough. Guide us to do that better this week. Guide us in our readings. Thank you for loving us. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks, folks.